when I thought about this sermon, this idea, weeks ago, sometime in the summer, I didn't realize how difficult it would be to speak on this subject just having had my little girl in my arms. The subject is the relationship between all of us and our parents. All of us of all ages, particularly adults, where we have responsibility for those relationships. The subject speaks not to everyone because all of us are parents, but to all of us because all of us are children of parents. There's a trend that didn't start yesterday. We read about it as early as the book of Genesis. And the trend is of family estrangements, and particularly a growing trend of parental estrangements, adult children abandoning their parents. And we might ask, why? Why would adult children abandon their parents? And the reasons are multitude. There are many reasons. Because our parents embarrass us, because our parents are aging, because their pants don't fit, because they're off-colored jokes, because of all the things that we see in our parents that we realize in ourselves and dread to look at in the mirror. We say, in a world, a land, and an age of comfort and rights, don't I have the right to be comfortable and not to look at a parent that might embarrass me? Don't I have the right to distance myself for something that I realize maybe in my heart one day I'll become? Because genetics, after all, are strong and so are influences. We look to our parents and we see an element of ourselves and of them, and so we distance ourselves, but look at the pain that's caused throughout our world because of these particular estrangements. Parents who brought us into this world and did their best, not our best. They weren't as good as us, obviously. But those parents who did their best to raise us to be the best people that we could be, with frailties, because they too had frailties. I think about people who no longer have their parents here. And I wonder, is this a night on this Yom Kippur when we look searingly into the truth of our hearts and our lives and ask ourselves, can we amend, can we make amends with those relationships? Can we, with our eyes closed, with our mouths shut even, utter words to our loved ones who have passed away, those parents, and say, I no longer need the hold of my anger to grip you. Who needs that? Can we look to those relationships and say, instead, let me be inspired by all that you tried to be? I think about these relationships, and I think about an article that I read in the New York Times a few weeks ago, and it was an article that inspired these thoughts. It was called When the Ties That Bind Unravel. It addressed the issue of parents being abandoned by their adult children. It cites the work of Joshua Coleman, a psychologist and an author of a book called When Parents Hurt, who sees a rising trend in family fractures. And what concerns him isn't the children who abandon those parents who abuse them, because that's justifiable and necessary. What concerns him is those children, adult children, who abandon their parents or hold them at arm's length because of misspoken words, because they were overly nosy, because they cared too much or in an inappropriate way, because those parents tried but failed their children, because of an issue of money, because of a boyfriend, because of a holiday meal missed, because of a card not sent, a call not returned, because the parent looked left when we expected them to look right, because they said right when we expected them to say left, because those parents in their frailty disappointed us. So Coleman looks to these relationships and he says, is it necessary that we should have this much pain in our world? Or maybe through a book, or maybe even through a sermon, or a moment of introspection, we can realize what we can do in this community to change that. What we can do to make meaning of this evening of our lives, so that the miles spent on freeways would be worth it. So we can leave with something tangible and important other than inspiring words and melodies, because we could realize that the most important relationship mentioned in those 10 commandments is ours with God and ours with our parents. It says in that 5th commandment, strangely, honor your mother and your father. And maybe the reason, in a series, a litany of 10 commandments that deal with holiness and deal with the ethics of interpersonal relationships, theft, dishonesty, that the author of Torah, that this biblical author gave us, honor your mother and your father, might have been because since the beginning of time, that author realized that with this we would struggle. That long before there were psychologists to tell us how we struggle and why we struggle, we would struggle. And so we look at estrangements in the book of Genesis, and we realize that throughout human history, we've needed to be commanded, obligated to do something, to rise to the challenge of honoring those who gave us life and did their best to raise us to be who we are. When I look at Coleman's words in his book, and as cited in this New York Times article, I realize that his focus and my sad fascination isn't with those children, as I said, who rightfully distance themselves from reprehensible criminal parents, but instead it's from good parents who lose their children over minor conflicts. After I read the Times article online, I read the post-its, so I should say the comments at the bottom. And they were endless, and they were touching, and they were tragic. And they were written by parents and adult children. I want to read one to you that gave me chills. It was written by a father. He said, I felt exceptionally close to a daughter who decided at age 17 that I was too intrusive, too nosy, he writes. And she stopped all contact. Divorce happened when she was 9. She never gave me a specific reason for cutting me off. First came the soul searching over what I'd done wrong. Like any parent, even good ones, I came up with a long list of mistakes, regrets. I was too noisy, he writes. I should have, I could have, I'm sorry Sadly, I reconfigured my ideas of proper parental boundaries. Thanksgiving came, Christmas came, high school graduation, birthday, even family funerals, weddings, nothing. I waited. I was heartbroken and I felt despairing guilt, but I also remained patient and committed to try to keep some remnant of communication and hope alive. I sent her letters on special occasions and thoughtful personal gifts for holidays, and I waited. She went away to college in California. Almost 2 years passed and the ice did not melt. No contact. Then one day, on one afternoon walk around the running track at Central Park at the reservoir, the wildest, weirdest thing happened. We ran into each other. What are the odds? He writes, happy is too pale a word to describe the relief, the ecstatic joy, the endearing words that we exchanged. We're now in regular contact. Lots of words have passed. Explanations, recriminations, reasons, stories. It was a little miracle. Parents, he concludes, do what you can to understand the situation and make things right. Let respect guide your path. Let go of whatever anger you may feel. Difficult, he writes, but not impossible. Never, and in capital letters, he writes, ever give up. Children, he concludes, cut your padres some slack. They won't be around forever. In some families, abandonment isn't as severe as this. In some families, the relationship between adult children and parents is at arm's length. Parents are given entry and exit visas into their children and grandchildren's lives, but they're never afforded citizenship, the right to simply travel freely when they want, where they want, to be a part of their lives. And I think about those relationships, particularly parents as grandparents. And what I see in my own life and in your lives, because this is my extended family of grandparents and aunts and uncles and grandchildren, is I see the pain. I see the pain in the eyes of grandparents who don't get that love because they weren't good enough to be allowed it. They don't get that unique love that can only come in life from a grandchild. Something particular and unique that they're denied because their visas didn't allow that. In some families, distances are created by words, and sometimes they're created by silence. And what I've asked you on Rosh Hashanah and so many times, what I ask myself in dealing with people, but particularly in this case, looking at our parents, ceased, living or dead, can we widen our lens? Can we see all of them? not merely their frailties and their faults? Can we see us in them? Can we see their greatness? Can we see the beauty of their relationship with one another? Can we see them in a friendship and realize something precious, something admirable in the way that they befriend? Can we watch them and see their passion in an area of their lives and ask ourselves, is that something that I can allow my grandchildren, their grandchildren, to be witness to? Can we listen to them and hear wisdom in their voices or only rebuke? Can we hear them in the present or only hear repetition of what they said in the past? Are we able on this Yom Kippur to hear their voices as they might speak to us today, not as they spoke to us those years of frailty and fault? I think of Joseph's brothers. When Joseph's brothers abandoned him first in a well and then with opportunity ceased, they sent him to Midianites to be taken as a slave. I ask myself, as any of us might, as we look at this in the lens of the parental relationship, did they realize the pain that they were causing the father Jacob? Or was their vitriol, their hatred for this reprehensibly arrogant brother really so overpowering that they didn't think of the impact that it would have on his relationship with his parents? Imagine when you read the Torah and you see that it says when they come to him with his torn coat, bloodied, and they say, this, he says, is my son Joseph's coat. It says in the Torah that he wept and he could not be comforted. It says when he held that coat in his arms, he tore his own clothing, the first mention that we know of kriya, of tearing one's garments in grief. And I stand here as the leader of a community who stands with parents as they make kriya for their children, sadly, tragically. And I ask you in relation to your own parents and your own children, does anyone deserve that grief and that pain? Should any parent with living children ever think that they're not available to them in life, that they can't have the pleasure of seeing the children they raised? These Yamim Noraim in Hebrew, these days of awe, have purpose. And their distinct purpose is different from any other day, is to ask us to look searingly honestly at ourselves and our lives, to tear open our guts, the rabbis say, to open our hearts and to look at what we hold and see what's there and ask ourselves, is this who I am? If after all, we're not made of cells and organs ultimately, but we're made of relationships, because that's what's going to define us in this world. That's what ultimately will be our mark and our stamp of remembrance on one another's lives. Not our height, our girth, or our wealth, but the wealth of our love for one another, the way we impact each other. Then the question is, what do we do on this Yom Kippur that might be different? I repeat that I don't speak only to people who have children, because that would be narrowing it to some and not all. My aim in these words on Yom Kippur is to speak to all of us, because all of us have a parental relationship in our lives. And maybe on this Yom Kippur, it's time to look at that and ask ourselves, if we are truly impactors, actors in God's world and in one another's world, what impact are we having? Are we truly causing grief or joy in our world? Is there someone who's in pain, someone close to us that we've made distant? Have we held somebody only miles away as if they live in a distant land? Have we stopped them from the love that might come in this new year? I spoke to you in Rosh Hashanah in terms that I thought were practical and concrete and gave you a blue band to remind you. And the blue band was the idea that we should come away with something useful. Not just ideas, not just theories, but something that we could choose to do differently. And what I want to ask you to do is to consider this three-part tool that I'll give you now in relation to one another, but particularly with a focus on our relationship with parents. And it is to write a letter in your heart or on paper that begins with dear, and then insert mom or dad, living or deceased. And then write the words, for the pain that you caused me by, and only you can fill in the blank, I forgive you and I no longer need to hold pain. And it might be a paragraph, it might be pages for all those pains. The question is, are you willing to say, I forgive you, and I no longer need to hold that pain or that anger? And the second part of 3 is, for this that I did, and name, fill in that blank, for these things that I did in relationship to you, my parents, I apologize. And the third, that might be the most life-giving of the 3, is for, and a long blank, I am so grateful to you. I'll repeat it so you go away with it memorized. Part 1 is, for these things that you did to me when I was a child or yesterday, I forgive you, and I no longer need to hold pain and anger. And the second part is, for these things that I have done to you, I apologize. And lastly, for these things, all these things, perhaps pages and pages and pages, that even came of the pain that was in our relationship, I grew, and I'm grateful to you. May this year be a year of wholeness and healing. May every one of us see ourselves as the children of Israel, but as adults in a community that can make adult choices. To realize that if we came through these doors, it was to do something, to seize our lives in a different way. To see ourselves in a mirror of scrutiny that only comes when we clarify who we are. To see our relationships with one another in this community. And ultimately to go back to those sources that gave us life. To find a relationship with Avinu Malkeinu, that in prayer we call our parent, our king, God, whatever that word means to us as the source of life. And then perhaps to look at those next sources of our lives, our parents. And with wholeness, forgiveness, and apology and gratitude to move forward in this year, 5773. Thank you, Shana Tova.